Welcome to Farm Here Daily, a Field Forward podcast. I'm your host, David Geiger. Today on Farm Here Daily, the government shutdown has ripple effects on many parts of the economy. I wanted to know how it may or may not affect the supply chain during the critical harvest season. Mike Steenhoek with the Soy Transportation Coalition joins us to go over that. Please be sure to like and follow the podcast as well as our social media at Field Forward Pod. We would love to have you join our community to keep folks informed about what is affecting our farmers. This is Farm Here Daily. And joining me on Farm Here Daily, we're going to take a look at transportation during the government shutdown. To do so, we have Mike Steenhoek with the Soy Transportation Coalition, the executive director over there. Mike, glad to have you back on Farm Here Daily. And let's go over that. We had a shutdown, one of the longest ones, maybe 5 years ago, something along those lines. And we saw some effects then. Let's just go over what we are looking at now in terms of a government shutdown and how that may affect our grain transportation system. What are your thoughts? Are there effects?
Yeah, so broadly speaking, the two areas of the government that are more exempt from the government shutdown, whereas they're still showing up for work, they're still doing their duties, is number one is that they're deemed to be essential employees. And now a lot of these people, they're still on the job, but they're not getting paid. So you're starting to hear of, for example, workers at TSA at the airport or air traffic controllers. Those are essential employees, but they're currently not getting paid. And so you're starting to hear cases of folks showing up sick, calling in sick, because they actually need to get a paycheck and they need to provide for their families. And so they're looking for other ways to supplement their income. So this whole area about essential employees. And then there's another area where they may receive funding from another source. So transportation is a really good example of that. So most funding, particularly when you're looking at for transportation funding, you have funding from the state, but you also have funding from the federal government. And a lot of the funding from the federal government will come from a different source called the Highway Trust Fund. Or there are other trust funds that the users of the system could be through a fuel tax. It could be through on the inland waterway system, a tax on diesel fuel. For ports, it could be a tax on the value of cargo coming into the United States to help provide for the needs of ports and harbors. So there's all these different trust funds that provide a different source of funding that are kind of on autopilot, if you will. So they're not as susceptible to the disagreements that are happening in Washington, D.C. The funding is continuing to be collected and it's continuing to be disseminated. Of course, with a lot of transportation funding is from state government. So that's an entirely different subject. And of course, each state will have their own fuel tax, tax on registration fees for new automobile sales. That all can kind of go in. And so obviously that's not impacted by this. So as a result, you're still able to see a lot of the, transportation infrastructure work still being provided to our country, but you'll start to see more slowdowns. You'll see things that are less efficient, because again, there's a lot of pressure and strain being put on a lot of these various government employees that some of them may be getting paid, some of them may not be getting paid. Of course, I think it's very safe to say that this decreases efficiency. Obviously, some agencies are more affected than others, but the overall net effect on our society is that it is increasing inefficiency, regardless of the area. Obviously, some areas more than others.
So I'm hearing there is continued work, but a little bit less efficiency. Specifically about the things that the federal government does control, because we have lots of, state level where there's some federal funding, but mostly the states will handle it. What about situations like navigable waterways, transportation in that way, as well as our port in and out systems? Are those also more or less still functional? They're essential services, and so they have employees that may or may not be getting paid, but are still there. Or are those a little bit more affected because there are contributing actors and essentially other people who work with those people who aren't quite as quote unquote essential?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things it also contributes to transportation projects allowed to proceed is I mentioned the various trust funds, but then also a lot of the funding from these projects came from an earlier appropriations bill. So, the most famous one is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that was signed into law in 2021. It's a 5-year law, so it expires in 2026. Well, that allocated a significant volume of funding for a variety of transportation projects. So some of these projects that already received their funding earlier, that has that set into motion this process for these projects to still be allowed to continue. So that's why you're still seeing road construction, for projects that are the recipients of federal funding. Well, but that's because there was an earlier appropriations bill that was signed into law and that unleashed that funding. Now, anything go moving forward, obviously that's what is really the big point of dispute, and that's why you're seeing all this impasse, and hence the government closure. So that's kind of the reason why we're still seeing a lot of these transportation projects proceed. It could be because they're funded in part by a trust fund, or some of their funding came from an earlier appropriations bill that was passed into law.
When you are looking at those trust funds, is there a point in which they do actually rely on the support or of the federal government consistently funding it, or is that something where they can last a pretty long while as folks in Washington figure things out?
Yeah, with a lot of these trust funds, particularly whether it's the Highway Trust Fund, that does not provide for all of our transportation needs, our surface transportation needs like roads and bridges. Usually, well, every year Congress has to pass an appropriations bill to supplement that. Now, again, most of that came from this earlier bill that was passed in 2021. So some appropriation measures in Congress are just 1 year in duration. There are a number of other occasions more limited where you have a multi-year funding allocation. The highway bill is the classic example. That's a 5-year bill. And so that's why, but obviously a point where you run out the clock on what was earlier appropriated and authorized, and then you have to replace it with something new. Well, Congress is not in a position to do anything new just because they can't come to an agreement on sources of funding moving forward. And so that's obviously a real concern that we have.
Mike, thank you for talking about some of the shutdown issues or problems. Is there anything you're watching for as the shutdown looks to continue to drag on? It does not seem to be a priority by either side to close that or end it right now. They're kind of playing a game of chicken almost. What is your perspective on just the future few weeks or months as we move into this?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to continue to look at some of these projects that have received funding earlier. Um, and what we're seeing right now is, in the midst of all of this disagreement between Republicans and Democrats, the White House, and certainly um, Democrats in Congress, we're starting to see some projects get withheld, even though the funding was appropriated already, and in and those projects should be proceeding. But with all of this disagreement and all this acrimony in Washington D.C., politics is certainly raising its head, and it's throwing a wrench in some of these projects. Now they tend to be more directed at some of the states, some of the Democratic states, but you know within agriculture, we care about funding for transportation projects in all 50 states, and regardless of what the political persuasion is of that particular state. So we want to see these projects continue. So that's something that we're going to certainly continue to monitor. And then when you start seeing, even if the the government officials who are most directly responsible for a particular project, even if that project's proceeding, there's going to be a point when you start seeing maybe some of the support staff, some of the support apparatus within a government agency that may be closed. And now all of a sudden, that's going to start affecting the efficiency of some of these projects get delivered. And so that's certainly something to keep in mind as well. And the longer this is allowed to drag on, the more of a weight that is going to be imposed on the U.S. economy, including our transportation system.
I suppose that is a good question to follow up on. We've had a situation right now where the executive branch is using some authority that is being questioned, but right now they are able to use it. It's not being really pushed back against by Congress or the Supreme Court in terms of being able to allocate funding and use funding at its discretion. And sometimes that means some states are being funds are being taken away from certain projects that were approved by Congress, and some funds are not being awarded, etc. What does that say for the stability of our structural impacts of our infrastructure? I should say, rather than structural impact, the infrastructure of our roadways, waterways, and port systems. Is that a concern?
Well, predictability and reliability is important for every industry, but particularly when it comes to supply chains and infrastructure. You don't build an effective infrastructure with its massive expense by allocating funding on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but if you're withholding it on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday, that's not a way to, or to only allocate it in state A, but withholding it in state B. The whole system is so interconnected, and it really thrives on predictability and reliability. And when there should be a time where we as a country vigorously debate the pros and cons of various issues, including transportation issues. But then when Congress comes to an agreement, and they are the Article 1 branch of government, there's a reason why they were stated first in the US Constitution. Once they come to an agreement, and then of course the president signs that into law, then that's the signal that these transportation projects will proceed. And then we in industry, individual state departments of transportation, they rely on that predictable, reliable partner called the federal government. And so then those projects can proceed, and then they can proceed more on time and within budget. But when it becomes much more erratic, that is most certainly the most efficient way of driving up the cost of a project. Is all of a sudden you have a delay imposed on it. The project's not going to go down in cost in the future if there's a delay. And so that's one of the things that I think a lot we can come to widespread agreement that once these projects do get the green light, they do need to proceed. If we want to debate and argue about future projects, whether the pros and cons of it and the merits of it, most certainly that's what healthy societies do. But once you've made that decision, they really need to proceed.
Mike, let's swap topics to a seasonal issue that we have, and that is the Mississippi River. We have, I guess, a year that we were a little bit concerned at the beginning because of as much rain as we got, but then it really dried down. And I haven't really had an update recently from you on this program on that. So could we just get a status of the Mississippi River and our export flow?
Yeah, it's unfortunate that we were having 4 now consecutive years of low water conditions on the Mississippi River. This is quite confounding to a lot of people, and very surprising to me because of the fact that we did have very robust precipitation in the spring throughout much of the summer. And it was really when we start hitting the middle part of August for as far as those states that feed into the Mississippi, the upper Mississippi River, that's when the spigot really got turned off. And yes, we did see water levels retreat as a result of that. The states that are further east that feed into the Ohio River, they've had a more prolonged period of dry conditions. But even then, it was still kind of a surprise that now even with very robust water through into well into August. Then all of a sudden, just having these dry conditions for the last month, 6 weeks plus now all of a sudden we find ourselves in low water conditions on the Mississippi River. So it's very frustrating. And this is the time where we need to have our supply chain operating at full throttle. Now the water levels on the river, they naturally decline at this time of the year. But what's worked over the years is that you have a robust amount of water in the system and including in the ground, that when the more natural drier time of the year, which is then late summer early fall, when that occurs, water levels retreat, but there's enough water in the system to uh, sustain an efficient navigation channel, and we're not seeing that right now. And so, with all of the challenges that we're confronted with when it comes to our exports, and we certainly are experiencing that, particularly from the soybean industry, you want your supply chain to not add insult to injury. You want it to be as efficient as possible. You don't want it to be adding costs to the overall transaction. You want it to be removing costs. And then when you have low water conditions on the river, the channel isn't as wide, so you can't attach as many barges together. The channel is more shallow. You can't load a barge as heavy as you normally would. That makes the system less efficient. That adds costs, and that's obviously something that's very unwelcome at this time of the year.
What are some of the ways we can move forward on helping alleviate some of those problems when it is a large force of just nature? I've heard you talk about dredging before in the years that we've had interviews. Is that something that we still are not really as far along on as you would like?
Yeah, I mean that's something that we've certainly made progress on, and but that's something that we can continue to make progress with, is having those assets in place to really be able to forecast, um, when drought conditions are going to arise and what the impact on the river is going to be, and making sure that we're attending to those areas that are susceptible to sediment buildup, and really clear those. So it's the whole issue is the logic that I talk about all the time is the best time to respond to a catastrophe or a challenge is actually before the challenge rather than after the challenge. And we can always do a better job of making these predictions and seeing where the problems are materializing, and then really making sure you're addressing that before it becomes a real monumental problem.
Mike, one final note before I let you go. I want to just get a update on some of the mergers we have for our national infrastructure systems. Do we have any more knowledge on how those are progressing? And I know there's a kind of a few that have gone on over the last few years. What's kind of the state of some of those?
Yeah, I mean, the one that's really generating a lot of attention is the Norfolk Southern and the Union Pacific, their plans to merge. Now, this is one area where the government shutdown does impact this, because this this agreement between the two railroads, in order for it to be realized, it has to receive the approval of a government agency called the U.S. Surface Transportation Board, and they're the ones that approve railroad mergers, acquisitions, liquidations of networks, and those kind of things. Well, they're not in a position, because of the government shutdown, they cannot receive any kind of application from these two parties or any other kind of activity that might be similar. So this is it is on a standstill right now. That application is expected, somewhere late in 2025, provided that the government does return to operations. I mean, this is something that's a real seismic event within the rail industry. It would create the first transcontinental railroad from the East Coast to the West Coast. And there are agricultural shippers who do think like the prospects of that. They think that it could reduce and make efficient, this area where there's a handoff between one railroad and the next. It'll make it more seamless. And so there are some agricultural shippers that say they're located in the eastern part of the United States and they want to have more direct access to the West Coast to be able to export from that area, and vice versa. But that being said, there are a lot of agricultural customers who are very concerned about this, because what's in our best interest historically is you want to have as many transportation providers competing for your business. That's good for agriculture. And when all of a sudden you're eliminating those, that really shifts the the kind of the negotiating power from away from the customer and more to the transportation provider. You have less negotiating posture in that scenario. And one of the things that history does teach us is when you do have a lot of these mergers and acquisitions and consolidations, it can have upward pressure on rail rates. It can have a decrease in service reliability. And so that's why you're hearing a number of agricultural customers who are very concerned about it and will remain so. So that's something that we're going to obviously keep focused on, and really making sure that we're expressing the perspective of agriculture as this discussion proceeds.
Mike Steenhoek is the executive director of the Soy Transportation Coalition, joining us on Farm Your Daily. Mike, thank you so much for your time and analysis today.
Hey, it's good to be with you, David. Thanks for having me.
This is Farm Your Daily, a Field Forward podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Again, in order to continue to produce this type of local content, we would love to have you join our community, so please follow the podcast as well as our social media channels at Field Forward Pod. You can also find me on social media at Geiger Reports. Again, I am your host, David Geiger, and I'll be back again tomorrow, everybody.